Disclaimer. Other than myself, as the living being operating in both a private and public capacity simultaneously, and this podcast itself, which also operates in both a private and public capacity simultaneously and is owned and operated exclusively by myself, any product, service, and or entity discussed, displayed, and or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, or any kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve, to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. My fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, but can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. Any attempts to at all mitigate this effect that don't come entirely explicitly from myself in the form of releases on this podcast are, always have been, and always will be in reality occurring entirely against my consent and should never be rewarded whatsoever. There's absolutely no real evidence to at all prove otherwise. I do not, never have, and never will at all consent to relinquishing, surrendering, abandoning, trading, selling, or somehow being deprived of my birthright to possess and exercise my free will and what effectively becomes the writing and living of the story of my life. This includes but is not limited to any claims I traded, sold, and or gave away any rights to use, modify, distribute, copy, sell, and or reproduce it somehow. This applies not only to this podcast, but also any other communication I've ever done. There's absolutely zero real evidence to prove otherwise, and any attempts to communicate otherwise are objectively incorrect and should be treated as operating fully consciously and intentionally entirely against my consent and with absolutely unconditional, unrestrained, malicious intent towards me in ever doing so at all at any point in time. I am not and never have been attempting to represent anyone's views other than my own. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely accurate interpretations of objective reality. I do not, have never, and will never consent to at all be held liable for anything I release here or that I've ever said to my mailing list in the past, causing any kind or extent of loss, injury, harm, death, or any other negative or undesirable consequences to any entity, particularly if such occurred demonstrably effectively more or less entirely beyond my control and or as an objectively extremely justified consequence of others' objectively extremely unjustified behavior towards me. I'm not, never have been, and never will be trying to blackmail any entity, nor at all enable, facilitate, and or validate the blackmailing of any entity, neither through anything I release on this podcast, nor anything else I've ever done. And there's absolutely no real evidence to at all prove otherwise. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me or any entity operating at all with my consent or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. In any case of clear, direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details or anything else under any circumstances. This release and all other releases on this podcast are not and never have been sponsored at all, neither directly nor indirectly. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. This podcast is an extremely and completely accurate and authentic representation of me and my life and my feelings in real life, and is not, never has been, and never will be role-playing or for entertainment. It also is not, never has been, and never will be me flirting at all with anyone. I've created the entirety of this podcast under life circumstances of completely unjust, increasingly blatant, extremely legally facilitated, extremely malicious, extremely life-threatening, extreme disrespect, neglect, defamation, exploitation, and deprivation I've described in extremely meticulous, immense detail in public extremely consistently, despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago. My life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever, especially due to the extent of egregiously blatant criminal activity being inflicted on me. I'm effectively, by definition, experiencing terrorism that I've demonstrated irrefutably presents premeditated murderous intent towards me, to the extent that considering it anything less than conspiracy to murder me is definitely objectively inaccurate. This podcast is not intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence, due to my typically gentle nature, is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. This is especially relevant to if the extreme terrorism and violence being inflicted on my existence persists more or less as it has been, or gets even worse somehow. Further, it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that terrorism and violence. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time, nor have I ever at all consented to any communication claiming I've ever held positions contradictory with that which I state on this podcast. Any claims otherwise should be treated as intentionally malicious towards me and always having been occurring entirely against my consent and to my detriment, especially as there is definitely absolutely zero real evidence to prove otherwise. I create the entirety of everything I say on anything I've ever released on this podcast, just like every message I've ever sent to my mailing list in the past, and absolutely nothing and nobody other than me, living or non-living, deserves any credit for any of it, and there's absolutely zero real evidence to at all prove otherwise. Any even so much as attempt at all to somehow communicate otherwise in any of these regards and or in regards to anything else I've ever addressed on this podcast, especially without any real irrefutable evidence extremely clearly, explicitly, directly mentioning me specifically, while being extremely clearly, publicly presented, that does not depend on me being silent about it or in general on this podcast in order for it to retain any meaningful weight, and even more so especially without any real irrefutable evidence extremely clearly publicly presented that it's been brought to my attention extremely clearly in direct communication with me by an entity with an actually meaningful, discernible, identifiable, real life existence. And I didn't refute it. Absolutely, unconditionally, irrefutably, demonstrably is and always has been completely incorrect and absolutely unconditionally should be treated as being intentionally, completely, knowingly, extremely malicious towards me to ultimately an extremely life-threatening extent. It is very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate beyond any even remotely reasonable doubt that such is and always has been in reality inflicted on me by others knowingly, entirely against my consent and to my detriment, which has been fully, knowingly, and intentionally sustained with demonstrable, premeditated, murderous intent to such an irrefutably extreme extent that this podcast serves as irrefutable evidence. It should be considered at the very least conspiracy to murder me, if not even more so, attempted murder of me by any substantially significant entity involved. After my last release on this podcast, it's only becoming increasingly unavoidable that I'm going to seriously have to increasingly urgently pursue formally suing at the very least Kimmy and Jamie. My kindness clearly was yet again taken as weakness, obviously entirely against my consent and to my detriment. Now I know I've proven beyond any even remotely reasonable doubt why it's only ever going to be a massive mistake that gets egregiously exploited if I ever show such kindness again. at least certainly with this conflict only demonstrably, effectively worsening. And I'm going to prove it. Which, by extension, also further substantiates my assertions in regards to the demonstrable egregious malice having been inflicted on me the last several years intentionally by many. I'm going to start by documenting further evidence from Kimmy's stream shortly following the last release I made on this podcast.
I know my ASMR helps, particularly a lot of you guys who are being productive.
How Kimmy started that stream talking about her ASMR apparently particularly helping a lot of people being productive is extremely suspicious to me and seems like rather clear evidence she's been attempting to egregiously misrepresent the reality of something I attempted to clarify with my last release on this podcast. I was not at all retracting my previous statements about my position on the whole lip gloss thing. I was only clarifying that I, completely consistent with my integrity, obviously would want Kimmy to feel comfortable with genuinely expressing feelings for me and pursuing embracing them in the manner I've wanted if that's what she actually wants and has been trying to do. I was not at all attempting to validate any false narratives that I'd already otherwise invalidated with my previous statements on the matter. The fact that Kimmy most likely fully consciously and intentionally attempted to entirely non-consensually exploit an egregious misrepresentation of my statement due to it not being the most extremely meticulously carefully worded, it only ultimately serves as further irrefutable evidence of Kimmy's fully conscious and intentional defamatory misrepresentation of anything I've ever said or done that she's ever known of or had any access to. I was really trying to make sure the reality has been made extremely clear. Anyone ever trying to basically force me to address anything or simply suffer the consequences of violation of my energy and defamation of me that otherwise would be inflicted upon me as a result of supposed leverage over me through claims that anyone wearing lip gloss or chapstick or such things, especially as if I ever wanted or needed to be pushed to work in some manner or capacity through such things, has in reality only been perpetuating increasingly egregious defamation of me entirely against my consent, and the result that must be a large contributing factor to me being left in such an extremely thoroughly unrewarding suffering is nothing short of criminally attempting to perpetually trap me in what is effectively nothing short of blatant extreme slavery entirely against my consent and entirely to my detriment. I don't see my efforts on this podcast as work, at least not in the sense of any kind of employment. Employment suggests compensation for energy put in as work, and as my disclaimer attempts to make extremely and completely clear and evident, I've never received any such thing at all for any of my efforts, not only on this podcast, but even any leading up to it as well in any relevant capacity. I don't consider this podcast my job. I'm unemployed. My efforts here are work in the sense that it's extremely stressful and unpleasant, and I'd rather not have to do it. But it's effectively all that downside with no perceptible upside that could ever conceivably classify it as not being blatant, extremely brutal slavery by anyone attempting to perpetuate it at all. It's certainly not a hobby because, again, I don't enjoy doing it, and it's not even really voluntary for me to do it. I basically have to, or at best, the last nearly decade of my life becomes completely robbed from me as I'm left in extreme deprivation and isolation, and at worst, I'd end up murdered because of egregious defamation of me that's been getting perpetuated entirely against my consent and to my detriment. Also, my exposing and mentioning of Kimmy's extremely strange, seemingly continued involvement and attempted energetic provocations in relation to any of my extremely shady blood relatives and other pieces of garbage from my past is not, never has been, and never will be any kind of want, need, and or willingness to ever allow or tolerate having any of them back in my life at all, and certainly not encouragement or validation of any kind for Kimmy to engage with them at all or validate anything they've ever done and very well might even be actively continuing to do to me. I'm not at all retracting any of my previous statements on the matter, and I want it known that I intentionally extremely heavily refrain from indulging in providing information about a lot of my personal experiences I've had with those from my past. I seriously don't have any desire or willingness to deal with drama from any of them if it's at all avoidable, and I'm not trying to leave myself in a position where I could be vulnerable to rightfully facing defamation lawsuits myself from any of those that have maliciously harmed me from my past. I've also now improved my disclaimer to further protect against exploitation of any clarifications I might make about anything, further demonstrating that any statements I've chosen to make about anyone were not made recklessly. And then there's another part of that stream.
I mean, would you guys? I mean, okay. It's up to you if I should do an ASMR subathon one day, because, like, it's really up to if you guys want me to, because, you know, I'm just gonna talk about the elephant in the room here. Like, you can't have a subathon if nobody wants to, like, sub. So, like, so.
There have now been multiple instances in recent times where Kimmy has, in one of her streams shortly following one of my latest releases on this podcast, mentioned something being the elephant in the room, which is an expression I've never seen her use before until very recently in all the years I've extremely closely followed her online activity. In this specific instance, it was about whether or not she should have an ASMR subathon. Now, I'm well aware that the world doesn't revolve around me, and Kimmy shouldn't necessarily only ever consider things important equally to how I consider them important. But in absolutely none of such cases of her mentioning an elephant in the room has she been addressing anything I've actually at all cared about, or myself considered or wanted her to consider as particularly pressing, urgent, or elephant in the room worthy level topics, especially as far as any kind of reaction to this podcast goes. The only topic I've ever really been trying to press her to have to address in any capacity for the last several years, literally ever since she refused to properly address it at all over 7 years ago when I first started drama in her Discord server over it, is her attitude and behavior towards me in her seeming desire and willingness to engage with me romantically in a public and private capacity, and behaving in a manner extremely consistent to what many might call love bombing me for the first few months of our connection, and then extremely strangely suddenly switching up on me and seeming all too happy to become and remain forever really distant and fake and, well, without trying too hard to phrase it nicely, basically behaving like a massive slut and whore and behaving rather extremely hurtfully in a manner, seemingly completely unapologetically screwing around with other people all along as if I was a complete joke to her, and she seemed to have decided from the very beginning she was just going to tool me for everything she could, and then extremely ruthlessly abandon me as if I'm subhuman filth, while I'd in reality been the furthest thing from it to her all along. I just want an extremely clear, decisive, final decision on whether she's going to treat me like a human being worthy of respect and embrace the kind of connection I've always hoped we could have together, meaning she will begin directly communicating with me in the very near future, or if that's truly never going to happen, and I should seriously start taking formal legal action combined with further exposing of her and her associates on this podcast and ultimately completely unapologetically destroy her life for her having proven irrefutably, demonstrably trying to destroy mine the last 7+ years with egregious defamation and infliction of emotional distress she's clearly intentionally herself perpetuated on me and immensely, unbelievably heavily enabled, facilitated, and validated her associates and other malicious bad faith actors to perpetuate to the point it's demonstrably become a conspiracy to murder me that Kimmy remains egregiously negligent towards the reality of to this day, which perhaps makes another part of that stream relevant for me to address.
Hello, Kelvin. You troll. Hello. Hello, Keone. Alright, everybody, you must be on your best behavior. Because the mod is here. King Coney the mod. He's watching you. He's watching your every move. No matter what you do, Keone, do not delete messages. You don't have to, though. Like Randy. Message deleted. Oh gosh. Keone, please. Keone, you're abusing your power. Oh my gosh. Chat. I'll put an end to this. What the? Keone has taken over this stream. He even deleted my message. What is this abuse? What is this mod power? What is this? Oh my gosh. What is happening? Imagine there's like somebody new to Twitch who has no idea what's going on and they're like, wait, what? Oh my god. What is this chat?
I found that whole part with Calvin and Keone exceptionally strange. In all the years I've extremely closely followed Kimmy's online activity, I've never witnessed something like that. It seems to me like both Calvin and Keone have some kind of extremely shady situation they're involved in where they've likely intentionally been trying to make it seem like I'm afraid of them for some reason. And with Kelvin literally being a licensed attorney that's part of a law firm, and Keone being a well-known moderator and close friend of the Offline TV and Friends group, I don't have terrible difficulty imagining why they'd think they can act like I should be or ever have been feeling intimidated by them or something like that. Accordingly, I wanted to be extremely clear that neither Kelvin nor Keone scare me, nor do they have any real ability to appease me, force me to shut up, change my position, or offer anyone any real leverage over me. They never have, and any claims otherwise are completely false with absolutely zero real evidence to at all prove otherwise. I don't know for sure if Kelvin's really strange recent appearances in Kimmy's Twitch chat the last month or two after his basically complete silence for several years is some kind of actual indication of them having some kind of more serious romantic involvement behind the scenes all along, or if it's really just some kind of weird behind-the-scenes power struggle leverage thing because Jamie's egregiously criminally violating my energy entirely against my consent to my detriment and getting repeatedly exposed by me and facing pressure as a result, but I extremely highly suspect it's the latter. Regardless, looking at Kelvin's Twitter, it's rather obvious to me that he's behaving with dependence on extremely false narratives about me that are being fed through Arya's energy in the Jamie, Lily, Arya trio I've already proven clearly has extremely heavy involvement in this conspiracy to murder me. Notice the white heart emoji he used in the pinned tweet, which, while I wouldn't normally associate a random person with this conflict if they used it, I find appropriate to utilize as incriminating evidence against Kelvin here. He's clearly applying pressure in a coercive manner towards me, as well as facilitating further perpetuation of extremely false narratives in relation to me. A licensed attorney like Kelvin certainly should know that, given the situation, his behavior becomes evidence of, at the very least, intentional infliction of emotional distress and criminal coercion against me. He's part of a law firm, meaning his recent extremely strange appearances in Kimmy's chat can definitely be seen as flaunting having legal resources in an attempt to bully and intimidate me into silence as I'm exposing things on this podcast. Anyways, I suppose I'm going to have to further expose Jamie in order to protect myself from the extremely false narratives about me she's clearly been trying to perpetuate. Her behavior only gets even more blatantly incriminating and demonstrative of her fully conscious and intentional, egregiously unapologetic, premeditated, murderous intent malice she's intentionally, relentlessly inflicting emotional distress to the furthest extent possible on me with. She had a certain extremely incriminating dialogue on her stream, which happened a day before the last release I made on this podcast.
I hope you guys know that I just genuinely like discussing things, and I really want people to get used to the limbo of discussing things without there being a permanence to it, because we're just constantly getting more data and more more really great points when it comes to discussing things, and I feel like open, unended conversation is very healthy to have. Versus this culture of hey, what's your opinion on this? What's your stance on this? Are you on this side? Are you on that side? I feel like it's not that black and white. But yeah.
I find this behavior to be unbelievably, extremely, egregiously, deviously conspiratory to murder me. I'm not going to include the whole thing here because it's 30 minutes of Jamie yapping. But before she said what I clipped there, she was talking about diet, erectile dysfunction, surrogacy, and birth control. An extremely strange sequence and combination of things to decide to comment on how she did. That paints an exceptionally inaccurate and harmful narrative about me if she's saying it with any kind of implications that anything she discussed there is at all relevant to anything I'd want to talk about, or that would at all appease me, force me to shut up, change my position, or offer anyone any real leverage over me. as if her desire and or willingness to discuss it even remotely at all gives anyone any even remotely adequate reason to believe it would stop me from pursuing formal legal action against her and Kimmy. I've never been looking for advice or open dialogue about diet. If I wanted to focus on it more, I'd do my own research for myself, and assuming I actually had resources and wasn't literally homeless and forced to eat out of the garbage to survive, I'd be fully capable and willing to cook for myself and eat whatever diet I wanted. I've never been interested in watching Jamie or anyone else cook anything, nor have I ever wanted, needed, or been trying to achieve getting anyone to do any kind of research or put any kind of energy or effort into cooking, baking, or anything relating to food in general. Any attempts to present otherwise are complete lies with absolutely zero real evidence to substantiate them. I don't have erectile dysfunction, I never have, and I have no particular concerns about ever suffering from it in the future either. I've never even once in my entire life said or done anything that should have ever given anyone even remotely adequate reason to believe otherwise. I can count on my fingers on one hand how many times in my entire life I would have liked to be able to get an erection but had considerable difficulty or just couldn't. And none of them are at all recent. Even in those cases, I was never worried or insecure about it because I understood I was simply under extreme stress at the time, and the circumstances I was in were quite extremely far from what I'd consider favorable for multiple reasons. I have no interest in surrogacy, and I never have. I've never even once in my entire life said anything that should have ever given anyone even remotely adequate reason to believe otherwise. I've always extremely clearly stated my complete lack of desire for or willingness to tolerate ever having children or taking care of children for any reason through any means. And I've elaborated multiple times already at this point in extremely meticulous detail that it's not out of spite or malice towards anyone, nor out of mental illness of any kind. Desire to reproduce and desire to have the pleasure of engaging in sexual intimacy for the sake of enjoying the act in and of itself are simply two distinguishably different things I've always extremely clearly distinguished as separate in my mind for as long as I can remember. And while I've never felt any of the former whatsoever, I've felt the latter extremely intensely since almost as long as I can recall having memories of anything at all. I myself have never struggled with what birth control method I'd use or want a partner to use, nor have I ever had any reason to concern myself with research on the topic even. I have such a considerable latex fetish that I literally prefer to wear condoms even just to touch myself, so I certainly don't have much desire to have bareback vaginal intercourse with anyone, and I never have, and I'm perfectly fine and okay with that. I've never said or done anything that should have ever given anyone even remotely adequate reason to believe otherwise. I'm not, and have never been suffering from feeling unable to discuss intricacies of any sexual topics with anyone, male or female. I simply lack the desire to discuss these things with just anyone, especially someone like Jamie, who clearly extremely egregiously abusively misrepresents anything I ever do to make it seem like I'm somehow disingenuously flirting with her, or I'm somehow a fraud or a bad person in general. Nobody else has ever approached me or shown any particular, if at all, interest in discussion of any of these topics with me in any capacity before, and certainly not in any kind of situation where I'd care to give them my input, especially knowing how disgusting subhuman filth some individuals can be, with how they try to exploit any knowledge about you that you might share with them. It's not like I've been scared to share, confused or indecisive about my positions on these things, or unable to articulate myself clearly about them. I'm left with the feeling that Jamie has been extremely carelessly and recklessly, intentionally, extremely egregiously misrepresenting me, entirely against my consent and to my detriment for the last several years, by fully consciously and intentionally, extremely viciously exploiting extremely false narratives about me that attempt to discredit me by portraying some kind of guilty position in me for refusing to engage with her in relation to these topics and or other sexual concepts or topics in general. In reality, I've simply made it rather extremely clearly known all along that I've always paid the bare minimum of any attention to any of Kimmy's associates because I wanted it to be extremely evident that I'm utmost focused on and only really interested in having the kind of connection with Kimmy I've been saying I've always wanted first and foremost, and unless I achieve that, I have absolutely no want, need, and or willingness to ever tolerate having any of her associates in my life at all, even if they're more distant associates. Jamie blatantly, extremely, disgustingly flaunts that she really wants people to get used to the limbo of discussing things without there being a permanence to it, in a manner that's perhaps the pinnacle of irrefutable evidence that by Jamie's own self-admission she wants it publicly known that she's operating with complete disregard for my safety, well-being, consent, and even fully consciously and intentionally with utmost malice towards me, in strategically attempting to endlessly perpetuate these extremely life-threatening circumstances I've been left in, while she actively continues to conspire and make attempts to end my life and sabotage and destroy everything I do to defend myself from the egregious defamation her and others inflict on me entirely against my consent and to my detriment relentlessly. There are no substantial facts that I deserve to have to suffer so much extremely meticulously having to elaborate on in the manner I've effectively been forced to with this podcast. There very much should be an openly, publicly acknowledged, widespread perception of my perspective and opinions formed by many on this conflict, and you most certainly have to pick a side and are picking a side whether you verbalize it at all in any capacity or not, especially if you're at all associated with Kimmy. You either believe me and care, or you don't. You can't actually be in the middle, especially when it's increasingly, exceedingly, extremely clear that if you're even remotely reasonable and not being egregiously biased against me, you absolutely must see extremely clearly that I'm entirely the actual victim in this conflict and not at all a fraud. And turning a blind eye to that means you are increasingly, irrefutably, actively facilitating an ongoing conspiracy to murder me that is demonstrably persisting, increasingly, irrefutably, entirely against my consent, and exclusively to my extremely severe detriment, literally every second it continues. And then there's also this.
Jamie's in a good mood now. Dude, whenever I'm in a bad mood, like, you know what's a really funny thing? The other day, I think I was talking to someone, and I was like, one day, I want everyone to be scared of me. I was in a pissy mood. And they were like, Jamie, everyone's already scared of you. And I was like, oh. When you're in a bad mood, I feel it too. Yeah, that's the point. I always say like, oh, if I'm happy, everyone's happy. So just make me happy.
But like when I'm happy, everyone's happy. It's like so contagious. If I hold that power, shouldn't we focus on making me happy?
It's so strange for Jamie to say she wants everyone to be scared of her, and even more strange for someone to tell her they already are. How can everyone be scared of Jamie when I clearly most certainly am not? And I've been extremely deeply unhappy all these years. Yet I'm sure Jamie's experienced much happiness in that time. So what's this complete garbage of Jamie claiming when she's happy, everyone's happy? Clearly, she's shown such extremely devious, heavy, energetic violation of me that she must have been portraying for a long time and probably to this day lies that I'm scared of her and I'm happy when she's happy, or I have some want or need to appease her or make her happy, basically no matter what exactly that entails. Completely false. I couldn't care less if Jamie's happy at all or not, and I've never been particularly trying to make her happy, especially if that comes at all to the detriment of me being able to experience the life I've always wanted with the kind of connection with Kimmy I've always wanted. Kimmy's the one I've been trying to make happy all these years. Well, and myself. I've done some more research on the legal process, and I have no issue paying what will likely be a roughly 30% contingency fee to whatever attorney I'd hire to handle the proceedings of my case. I'll definitely be suing for amounts in the millions, and definitely a lot more than just like 1 or 2. You know, given the extent of demonstrable damages of multiple categories I've demonstrably suffered being inflicted on me over such a prolonged period, and the kind of egregious exploitation of my demonstrable potential that's been occurring. Which means that even if I were to win only a few million, any attorney that helps me stands to gain at least $1 million. And I'll only continue to work with them to present my case and all relevant evidence even more thoroughly to maximize the winnings every step of the way, if it's really going to come to that. I maintain that in truth, I wouldn't ever be satisfied with receiving any amount of money as compensation for being denied of the connection with Kimmy I've always wanted, because even literally infinite money could never be enough to make up for the incomparable loss beyond words that being denied of the connection I've always wanted with Kimmy would be to me. But it's only becoming increasingly extremely painfully evident to me that the more I try to achieve a peaceful resolution to this conflict, where Kimmy absolutely must embrace that kind of connection for such a thing to even be possible, the more it only empowers subhuman filth to make excuses, sabotage everything I'm trying to do, inflict even more harm on me in multiple regards, and leaves me only facing further complete refusal from Kimmy to promptly comply with any kind of arrangement I've made extremely clear is the only kind I'd actually be willing to settle this matter with, so I don't ultimately end up going down an extremely dark and destructive path involving absolutely unconditionally completely destroying her life and her associates' lives to the maximum possible extent I can, literally no matter what anyone ever says or does. Even if no amount of money would ever really make things okay, if I'm not going to ever get treated properly by Kimmy regardless, I'm most certainly not trying to at all reward her abuse and neglect and let her leave me in extremely life-threatening deprivation while her and her associates continue to target me with their extremely devious, clearly calculated malice as Kimmy continues to try to thrive off constantly disappointing me and trying to leave me drowning in drama and suffering and destroying my life for her own selfish gain as if I owe her or anyone else anything. In my research, I learned that in order to really secure a win in a defamation lawsuit, I need to prove what's called actual malice. Well, I'm proving that both Kimmy and Jamie have been doing the defamation, both knowing a lot of what they were saying was false, and also that they behaved with reckless disregard for the truth, to rather extreme extents, in multiple instances. So it definitely meets those requirements. It seems I was correct in believing that it's not necessary for a public figure to explicitly mention your name while inflicting defamation on you in order for the defamatory actions to be considered as such, as long as you can demonstrate a clear pattern of reactions that are far too suspiciously relevant to what you communicated to them for it to be reasonably considerable as a mere coincidence that they behaved in a certain manner at certain times. For at least both Kimmy and Jamie, I've definitely adequately proven by now that they pay extremely close attention to what I release on this podcast, and they extremely deviously have been reacting for the last over a year of time I've been running it, and released over 30 different releases on it. I'm considering US law, by the way, not the looser Canadian laws around defamation. I'm applying a standard that definitely holds the same kind of immense weight on Kimmy and Jamie, regardless of whether I pursue the lawsuit formally in a court in either country. Legally, actual malice doesn't even necessarily mean the person was angry. It's a legal standard of intent, not emotion. Even if I can't prove their emotions in behaving how they have towards me, I definitely can, and I'd say already quite extremely thoroughly have, proven their intent. I've also extremely meticulously documented their public behavior for over a year now that I've been running this podcast, and I've proven I have reasonable grounds to assert they have been knowingly involved in a conspiracy to murder me, involving my blood relatives and likely also others from my past that has likely been going on for several years while being intentionally hidden from me for as long as possible entirely against my consent and to my detriment. So they can neither prove I've made any accusations knowing they're false, nor that I was reckless in making them, meaning they cannot rightfully countersue me for defamation. They don't realistically stand a chance in court, yet they continue to treat me like a joke and completely refuse to directly communicate at all, while they clearly continue to feed extremely false narratives that attempt to criminally exert coercive, fabricated leverage over me to try to drive me clinically insane and leave me locked up in a mental health institution, thrown in jail, or dead from probably getting shot by a hitman or something that only ever even possibly had access to me because I was left homeless from the egregious exploitation facilitated by all that defamation in the first place that I've proven must have been happening for many years if it's been so extreme the entire time I've been running this podcast to this day. I can literally bring in several of the staff of places I frequent as witnesses to the fact that I'm homeless and have been for a long time, and I literally dig through the trash to find food to survive to eat. I know for a fact I can get tons of video evidence of my homelessness. I know there's no real evidence of me having any bank accounts I actually opened myself or am at all aware of, from at the very least ever since my public affidavit I provided a video of me saying on a previous release on this podcast. I've already extremely extensively stated countless times that absolutely no communication being done in any capacity aside from this podcast should be considered at all to be me or any entity operating at all with my consent to represent me in any capacity to any extent. There's absolutely no real evidence to refute any of my claims about myself, and neither Kimmy nor Jamie nor anyone else has had any real willingness to even remotely adequately, directly, explicitly, publicly address me or this podcast to even remotely seriously attempt to substantiate any position that attempts to discredit anything I've been saying and the power it effectively demonstrates me to in reality possess. I don't deserve to be treated how I'm being treated. I won't tolerate attempts to endlessly drag me into drama and target me with blatantly malicious lies, trying to discredit and sabotage me as Kimmy and Jamie try to facilitate dragging their associates into this conflict increasingly viciously, obviously entirely against my consent, as I suffer in circumstances they know are extremely life-threatening and deprived that are completely unjust and undeserved and obviously unwanted by me. If I won't get the respect and attention I deserve without having to take formal legal action attacking those demonstrably acting with extreme malice towards me, then perhaps starting to take that legal action will force them to stop trying to prolong my suffering and the extreme harm and danger these mind games and continued defamation and coercion cause, and actually start putting me in a better position to start getting long overdue rewards for all my efforts over all these years I've been exploited and neglected by everyone. This isn't a goddamn joke. Continuing to try to drag conflicts out, blatantly admitting to your intent to endlessly attack me with intent to silence me and deplete my resources and exhaust me with dramas and mind games I've demonstrably never wanted to at all involve myself in, while you're flaunting having lawyers on your side and trying to intimidate me with both devious legal threats and demonstrably malicious targeting of my reputation, is not only demonstrably extremely reckless defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, it's also demonstrably criminal coercion given the situation I've proven myself to be in. And proving the kind of malice being exerted on me to the scale it has certainly must be some kind of evidence of conspiracy to murder me as well, or at least certainly substantiated by me to claim it must be, because of how egregiously unapologetically information is clearly intentionally being hidden from me to this day about why the hell I'm still in such a goddamn unbelievably insane nightmare of nightmares I so extremely clearly couldn't be further from deserving and certainly never wanted to be in. Only extremely solidly positions me to formally press criminal charges eventually as well, which I have every intent of doing with how things are going. This conflict is clearly not going to end with me as a complete loser, no matter how you look at it, if you're being even remotely reasonable objectively, since I've now explicitly stated myself as intentionally operating in a capacity accepting full responsibility for my public statements in the capacity of a public figure. Even if I don't get substantial attention, to sue me for defamation, even in Canada, you have to prove the same kind of legal standard of actual malice from me towards you that I've proven exists towards me from Kimmy and Jamie. Anyone I've ever encountered in my life or talked about are all grossly incapable of ever even really approaching adequately meeting it. And anyone at all attempting to communicate otherwise is lying and has absolutely zero real evidence to prove otherwise. This is just a huge loss waiting to happen for Kimmy and Jamie. And it's not like any of the liars from my past have any actual evidence to try to sue me or press criminal charges on me with any real weight either. So that's not something I'm afraid of. If I wasn't absolutely certain of these things and being completely honest, it makes absolutely no sense for me to be behaving how I am, and I'm extremely well aware of that. How can you even remotely adequately attempt to communicate addressing how much of an evil, demonic, malicious, cruel, manipulative psychopath all the substantially relevant entities contributing to my life being in the state it's in right now are? Subhuman filth. They're not human. They're complete demons. It's not even just about being a criminal, because even career criminals aren't necessarily extremely unhinged, vicious psychopaths with the most egregious disregard for any actual semblance of decency or sanity. These are soulless, completely morally bankrupt, absolute psychopaths with absolutely zero real regard for human life and an inhuman obsession with their immense power and influence they built through lies and unbelievably, extremely egregiously abuse basically constantly, as demonstrated by how they continue to behave towards me to this day. Look, I've really tried extremely hard to see the best in a lot of people throughout my life, and to this day, even when it really seems it doesn't exist, I've been extremely consistently demonstrating a level of kindness and grace towards even those that have been extremely awful to me, who I'm not being given any even remotely adequate evidence to suggest would ever show someone like them if they were in my position. Trying to guilt trip me or spin things to act like I'm blackmailing anyone or coercing anyone is complete garbage. Like I said, I'm only trying to pressure Kimmy to embrace the feelings for me she supposedly had all these years, not clout chasing, not blackmailing anyone for anything, not pursuing any other ulterior motives. It's irrefutably, extremely abundantly evident from what I'm releasing on this podcast. Defending my reputation from egregious defamation while showing kindness adequately demonstrating my integrity is not blackmail by any reasonable standard. And when I'm in a situation to just sue and obviously win, if it was just about money, why would I even bother with being so kind and patient for so long if I was just after money all along? It makes no sense to ever even seriously attempt to suggest. I'm clearly not some extremely mentally unstable maniac, so I clearly don't belong in a mental health institution. I'm most certainly not suicidal, and there's clearly no real evidence to at all seriously suggest I at all want and or deserve to die through any means, nor that I ever truly have been or will be. If Kimmy's seriously dead set on endlessly perpetuating me being extremely brutally terrorized in a manner that effectively forces me into an extremely brutal, life-threatening slavery I get literally absolutely no actual reward for tolerating whatsoever, as I'm effectively forced to extremely meticulously further expose her, Jamie, and anyone else that becomes evidently so relevant to all the crimes and injustices being inflicted on me that attempt to rob me of my soul and leave me so extremely deprived and in extremely life-threatening, entirely undeserved circumstances to this day. It's time I actually start looking for an attorney to sue Kimmy and Jamie, at the very least, for what will pretty much certainly be millions of dollars as I continue to expose them and their associates for increasingly egregious behavior as their lives only increasingly continue to fall apart because they made the extremely stupid decision to refuse to promptly comply with my extremely reasonable attempts to resolve this conflict in the only manner I'm willing to, which I'm in reality fully within my rights to demand without escalation into formal legal action against them. I've given multiple options for Kimmy to directly contact me and many opportunities for compliance with a resolution to this conflict I'd accept, but I only get increasingly harmed every time as a result. I've challenged many to explicitly bring attention to this podcast and the conflict I'm exposing through it for over a year, yet have only faced even more extreme adversity instead of ever actually getting any help from anyone that actually meaningfully empowers me to improve my life circumstances that I've irrefutably proven are extremely egregiously unjust and unwanted. There's absolutely no objectively even remotely adequate excuse that anyone at all substantially involved can at all reasonably present to remain even remotely dignified for their ongoing contribution to being part of the problem as to why I remain in such extremely harmful, deprived life circumstances despite all my efforts. My escalation into taking formal legal action if this continues any longer is not and never will be at all even remotely demonstrably reasonably assertable as any kind of indication of a compromise of my integrity to any extent, nor any kind of inconsistency or incoherent with my established position and personality traits I claim and demonstrate myself to possess to the extent I do on this podcast. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I've simply been left in a situation where it only empowers and validates extremely false, malicious narratives attempting to frame me as and justify treating me like a fraud and a joke if I don't escalate into formal legal action given the continued demonstrable complete lack of any real respect, decency, remorse, or any kind of actually good intentions towards me from Kimmy, Jamie, or any of their associates, or anyone else at all conceivably involved in this conflict in any capacity to any extent, unless Kimmy's seriously willing to start directly communicating with me in the very near future and treating me properly. I'm seriously completely done tolerating her making any kind of excuses to refuse any longer, and I really mean it this time. I absolutely, unconditionally, completely refuse to ever attempt to justify myself on this, even once more, before initiating formal legal action if I continue to see a lack of prompt compliance from Kimmy. I will simply follow through and seriously start reaching out to attorneys to pursue formal legal action on this matter without any doubts or regrets ever again, and absolutely nobody should expect anything less. And let me make myself extremely clear on this. There's absolutely no possibility of ever reaching a settlement agreement where I accept to shut up about this, with or without removing anything I've ever posted on this podcast, for any amount of money or any other kind of compensation or reward. It's never happening. Not only will I be pursuing a lawsuit suing for millions in demonstrable damages, which I'll only be further reinforcing evidence for and only facilitating my attorney to increase demands in larger quantities for, the more this conflict is dragged on, but I'll also absolutely unconditionally insist on complete refusal to sell my soul in any capacity, to any extent, ever, entirely regardless of the outcome of the lawsuit. I'm legally eligible for damages regardless for the irrefutable, demonstrable, extreme harm inflicted on me for the last 8 years ever since Kimmy and Jamie started exploiting my existence through that meetup and the demonstrably completely genuine feelings I've had for Kimmy ever since. And nobody's entitled to deprive me of that if I refuse to shut up about it, even if I get compensated. I'm not trying to sell out, especially since I consider the defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress a part of a larger criminal undertaking against me, including conspiracy to murder that involves my blood relatives and others from my past. I'd get that money from suing and afford food and shelter and better equipment so that while I'm much safer and better fed, since I'd no longer be homeless and eating out of the garbage, I can work on my video game development endeavors alongside continuing to expose things on my podcast until I destroy Kimmy and Jamie and others' lives for me ultimately being denied of Kimmy regardless. And the quality of whatever I produce will only increase the entire time, making me a bigger nightmare for all my enemies. I haven't been working so hard all these years trying to end up getting a chunk of cash from a settlement or a won lawsuit against anyone and then just taking life easy or something. I've seriously been dreaming of and trying to work towards a life of having hours upon hours of extensive, tender, consensual, in-person sexual intimacy with Kimmy every day for the rest of eternity all along. It's really been my top priority and primary focus this entire time. There's truly nothing that will ever come anywhere even remotely close to truly making things better if I'm seriously going to be deprived of that. Ever. And I'll make absolutely certain, no matter what, that I never even slightly lose the ability to make it only an increasingly serious problem for everyone and everything that ever at all contributed to me being denied of that, despite me literally having made it my primary goal in life to achieve promptly all along.